Australia was one of the original 51 member states of the United Nations when it was declared in 1945. It's remained a member state ever since. And because of this, Australia has a very long history of being involved in or contributing to UN-led peacekeeping missions. And in fact, it's Australian peacekeepers who were involved in the first ever UN peacekeeping mission that took place in 1947 in what is now Indonesia. And you can see on the slide here, this is a picture of some of the first Australians who were deployed as part of that peacekeeping mission in Jakarta, which is now Jakarta, basically. And basically they were sent there as military observers. So Australians, some of the very first peacekeepers under the umbrella of the United Nations in 1947. Now since then, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 Australian peacekeepers have been deployed in over 60 peacekeeping missions all around the world. Who is a peacekeeper? So, primarily peacekeepers are members of the ADF, so the Australian Defence Force, so that is of course the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. But sometimes, often members of the Australian Federal Police are deployed as peacekeepers. And you can see a picture here of Sergeant Steve Walsh from the Australian Federal Police, who served in Cyprus as a peacekeeper and also later in East Timor and in Sudan. And this other photo here is a picture of military peacekeepers, so peacekeepers who come from the army. They're actually signals guys, and they're in Cambodia as part of an Australian deployment to a peacekeeping mission there in the early 1990s. It can also more recently be civilians, so people from the regular police force and civil service officers. They take on peacekeeping roles as well. What is peacekeeping then? So now you know who the peacekeepers can be. What is it that they're actually doing? So one scholar of Australian peacekeeping, Peter Londy, in this book that I've put up on the slide here, he's come up with a set of criteria to define a particular mission as a peacekeeping mission. And his criteria are, firstly, that the mission is about preventing or ending or dealing with the effects of a conflict. Okay, so it's about not about engaging in a conflict, but about trying to prevent or deal with the aftermath of a particular conflict. It's a mission that has to include a substantial military or police element that's provided by the contributing governments. It's composed of a multinational force. Now this is an important point I'll come back to in a minute. Generally peacekeeping missions are not just an Australian mission or just a New Zealand mission or just an American mission. It's a multinational mission, and it's usually those different national forces are working together under the umbrella of the United Nations. The fourth criteria is that the nations that send peacekeepers can't be party to the conflict at all, so they can't have had any role in the particular conflict they're going to kind of intervene in, and they have to be impartial between the belligerents, so between the two sides, for example, that have been fighting. And the fifth criteria is that the mission is governed by rules of engagement and practices in the field that ensure the minimum use of force that are consistent with achieving the objectives of the mission. Okay, so it's not like peacekeepers go out there all guns blazing. It's very much a stand back and observe, monitor what's happening, report on breaches of ceasefires, intervene only when necessary. So during the years of the Cold War, so that was that kind of ideological warfare that began at the end of the Second World War in about 1947, stretched to 1991, when the two kind of world superpowers, so the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, were locked into this kind of struggle, this ongoing struggle to try and ensure that their respective ideologies, so capitalism or communism, became the world ideology. So during that period, Australian peacekeeping efforts were generally quite restricted. It was only really about small numbers of officers who were being sent to distant nations like Cyprus or Korea before war broke out there in 1950, or to kind of zones of conflict like the Sinai Peninsula or Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And they were really there to act as observers. Okay, so really they were there to, as I said, monitor ceasefires, observe any military movements in a particular region, assist in the transition of a former colony to a newly independent nation, to try and ensure the safety of the civilians that had been caught up in whatever conflict or war had been going on. And it's worth noting here that in respect to criteria 5, that in most of these cases, these peacekeepers were only very lightly armed. In the 1980s and the 1990s, as the Cold War kind of started to its end, those long-standing tensions between the Soviets and the Americans began to thaw, and conflicts that had erupted in places like Angola in Africa were able to be worked out through the United Nations, through the involvement of the United Nations. So from this time onwards, there was a massive increase in the numbers of peacekeeping missions that were going on around the world. And as the number of these peacekeeping missions expanded, so did the nature of peacekeeping itself. And correspondingly, so did the number of Australians who were deployed on these missions. And here I think it's worth thinking about, why is that the case? Why in the 1980s and the 1990s are Australians suddenly embracing the idea of being involved in peacekeeping missions? So we have to think about the international and the domestic imperatives that are kind of influencing the Australian government at this point in time in their willingness to send out peacekeepers. So, they wanted to be seen as assisting the international community. They wanted to be seen to kind of be coming to the party, so to speak, with their major allies, particularly the United States. They wanted to be ensuring the safety of the region, and as you'll see, a lot of peacekeeping missions that Australians were involved in were in the Southeast Asian region or the Pacific region, so quite close to home. And also, there's this idea that the military needed to get some experience overseas because there'd been something of a dry spell in Australia when it came to military commitments after the Vietnam War. So, what did it mean for the Australians who were on these peacekeeping missions? So alongside those traditional roles, those monitoring ceasefires, providing peace and security, the remit of Australian peacekeepers from the late 1980s onwards also came to include things like mine clearance, so making sure they're going off to places like Mozambique in the mid-1990s and trying to demine, so dig up landmines, monitoring elections, for example in Namibia in Africa in the late 1980s when they were holding new elections, peacekeepers were sent there to make sure that those elections were done fairly and that people were able to go out and vote. Rebuilding infrastructure, again in Namibia, a big contingent of Australian engineers, and I think I read in Major Green's bio, he was one of those, so he can talk to this a bit more. So rebuilding infrastructure, buildings, roads, etc., water pipes, all that kind of stuff that have been damaged during times of war and conflict. Providing communications and transport, which is what Australian peacekeepers did in Cambodia in the early 1990s. I showed you that picture a few slides back. They were signals guys, so they were communication experts there to make sure that communications infrastructure was working in Cambodia. Also delivering or protecting the delivery of humanitarian aid, so food, medical care, etc. Kurdistan, after the first Gulf War, Australian peacekeepers were deployed there, so it's kind of northern Iraq, to deal with a huge number of Kurdish people who'd been displaced because of what had happened during the Gulf War. And also Australian peacekeepers took on that role in Somalia in the early 1990s as well. Australian peacekeepers have worked on weapons inspection, so looking for chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. Probably the most well-known example of that is in Iraq in the 1990s and then again in the early 2000s. And also some Australians have been attached to NATO-led peacekeeping missions. So these aren't UN-led missions. These are led by another, I won't say global, Northern Hemisphere organisation. And so Australians who were attached to NATO went over to the former Yugoslavia in the mid to late 1990s. More recently they've been in Afghanistan, and again Major Green can talk to you about that a bit more because he was there. And then another big one that was a non-UN mission that Australians have been involved in is the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands. Now that was an Australian-led mission. Lots of other Pacific nations contributed to that mission, and that was all about re-establishing peace in the Solomon Islands region. Again, very geographically close to Australia, so it's all about making sure your neighbours are okay to maintain security in the region. And then also some local police training and civilians to train up government officials in the Solomon Islands as well. Now all of this means that peacekeepers can be exposed to lots of different forms of work, and here we've got some images of peacekeepers in those different missions there. They're exposed to lots of different people and of course lots of different dangers or concerns, from landmines to disease to poverty-stricken civilians to threats to their own personal safety from former fighters, former soldiers. And as I said before, in most cases peacekeepers are only very lightly armed. Now in total, so from 1947 up until the most recent Australian peacekeeping operations, 16 Australian peacekeepers have died on their respective missions, and that includes members of the police, from car and plane crashes or accidents, from landmines, from contracting illnesses or getting sick, and from accidental gunshots as well. We'll spend lots more time talking about different missions, but I think the one we should hone in on really is East Timor, because this was the biggest peacekeeping operation that Australia had been involved with, and it was in part commanded by an Australian, Major General Peter Cosgrove, who you will of course recognise as our current Governor-General. Okay, so first a little bit of background. The Portuguese colony of East Timor was invaded by Indonesia in 1975, and there was lots of violence and lots of bloodshed for about 25 years after that, until a new Indonesian government, so a new government led by a new leader, agreed to allow the East Timorese to vote on what was going to be their future by holding a referendum about independence. So did they want to become an independent nation, or did they effectively want to remain part of Indonesia? Now, a UN operation, the United Nations mission in East Timor, was established to go over and to organise and conduct that referendum, that vote, make sure everybody could participate in it safely. Now that vote was held at the end of August 1999, and it resulted in an overwhelming number of people voting yes for independence. Okay? Now there were about 56 Australians that deployed as part of UNIMET, the United Nations mission in East Timor. But once that overwhelming yes vote had been announced, pro-Indonesian militia groups who were in East Timor launched a really awful campaign of violence and terror. They went through East Timorese villages and they set fire to buildings, they looted people's personal property. Many East Timorese were killed, and upwards of somewhere between, we don't really know, but somewhere between 300 to 500,000 East Timorese were displaced from their homes. About half of them left the territory altogether, a lot of them under threat of violence. Now, the pro-Indonesian militias also attacked the UNIMET compound, so basically the headquarters of where the United Nations peacekeepers were kind of living and working. And some or a lot of UNIMET members were actually evacuated from the region to Darwin by the Royal Australian Air Force. Now, as the violence remained basically uncontrolled, and there was lots of public outcry in Australia and in other countries around the world, Indonesia eventually agreed to the deployment of a multinational peacekeeping force. Now, this force was known as INTERFET, the International Force for East Timor, and it was pretty much organised and led by Australia. It was a non-UN force technically, but it operated under the guidelines or the provisions, whatever you want to call it, of the United Nations Charter and the United Nations resolutions. Now, there are about 5,500 Australian personnel who deployed as part of INTERFET, as well as Australian naval ships and Australian planes that were involved. But other members of INTERFET came from Brazil, from Canada, from Norway, from Germany, from the UK. But as I said, overall it was led by Australia. And one particular Australian you can see on the slide there, Major General Peter Cosgrove. Now, in the middle of October 1999, Indonesia formally recognised the result of that August referendum. East Timor formally became Timor-Leste, so an independent nation. And shortly after that, the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, this one here, as I said, there's a lot of acronyms, that was established, and it became fully responsible for the administration of Timor-Leste as it transitioned to independence. So that's kind of harking back to those older ideas of peacekeeping. Now, that particular mission concluded when they basically handed over most of those governmental tasks to the East Timorese in May 2002. And after that, some of the personnel from, let's call it UNTATE, were redeployed to this next United Nations mission, the UN Mission of Support to East Timor, which then evolved over time until about 2006, when it was called UNITOL, the United Nations Office in Timor-Leste, and their main role was all about training East Timorese police officers. So making sure that the East Timorese had their own security capacity, their own way of protecting their civilians. But, some of you may remember this, possibly not. In 2006, there was more violence in the region, more rioting, and Australians were again deployed to East Timor as part of a big peacekeeping operation, which was called UNMIT, the United Nations Integrated Mission in East Timor, again to try and bring peace to that fledgling nation as it was trying to deal with becoming a newly independent state, having a new government, and dealing with all this rioting and violence and everything. Now, Australians continued to serve in East Timor until late 2012, when the last of them kind of were brought home, but some military personnel remained there to, as I said, train their East Timorese counterparts. So, as that one example, East Timor demonstrates, peacekeeping is very complex. It involves lots of different tasks, lots of different types of work. It's unique to the specific circumstances or situation, and of course it can be very dangerous. You know, so these peacekeepers are being deployed into a region where they know it's very violent, there's lots of nasty things going on. Okay, so to finish up, as I said, I want to bring the focus back to commemoration, okay, to try and get you thinking about how peacekeeping's been commemorated in Australia, some of the challenges that are perhaps inherent in commemorating the kinds of activities and the kinds of work that peacekeepers do. So, on the 14th of September 2017, exactly 70 years after those first Australian peacekeepers I showed you right back at the start of the talk were deployed to Indonesia, or what is now Indonesia, a big memorial was dedicated to peacekeeping and peacekeepers on Anzac Parade near the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Now, I'm guessing a lot of you have been down to Canberra at some point, been to the Australian War Memorial. You know, that big road that leads up to the top that's got all the different memorials along the side. So now there's an Australian peacekeeping memorial there. And so it's taken its place alongside those memorials you might have remembered to Australian nurses, to specific conflicts like the Vietnam War, and to our long-term allies, the New Zealanders. So this memorial is dedicated to all peacekeepers, past, present and future, and it's designed to be a place where people can reflect and remember those who've served as peacekeepers for Australia. And it's a very beautiful memorial, as you can see. But it does beg the question, why did it take 70 years for one to be built? So several Australian historians have argued that peacekeeping is often overlooked when it comes to Australian military history. One of them is actually quoted, I'm quoting him, that the full admission of peacekeeping to the Anzac Pantheon has been very slow. So there are a few reasons that different historians have put forward to kind of try and explain this. Now, the first is the differing nature between Australian experience of war and Australian experience of peacekeeping. So if we think about particularly the First and the Second World Wars, they were huge wars. Thousands and thousands of Australians were involved in them. Most of them who went over to fight were volunteers. So they were civilian soldiers, as Mike was saying earlier today. And because these wars were so huge and they involved so many people, they had a massive impact at home. So you didn't have to be going and fighting in the First or the Second World War to feel the impact of it. And even the Vietnam War, which was a smaller conflict and a much more controversial conflict, continues to resonate because of the involvement of protest groups, of the issue of conscription, and through ex-servicemen who were increasingly vocal about their experiences. But traditionally, peacekeeping has involved far fewer Australians. The Australians that have been deployed on peacekeeping missions are usually professional military personnel or professional police personnel. So they're not civilian soldiers. And the impact of peacekeeping operations, with the possible exception of East Timor, hasn't been so widely felt at home. So excluding, immediate family members or friends of peacekeepers, most Australians don't really know all that much about Australian peacekeeping history or about the kind of continuous effort that Australia has put in to peacekeeping operations around the world. And I think that's probably not helped by another few reasons. As I said, 16 Australian peacekeepers have been killed in the over 70 years that Australians have been involved in peacekeeping. Now, that's tragic, don't get me wrong, but when you compare that to the 60,000 who were killed in the First World War, the 30-odd thousand who were killed in the Second World War, the 500 and odd who were killed in the Vietnam War, it's not as impactful, let's say. And I also don't think it's particularly helped by the fact that peacekeeping, again with the exception of East Timor, doesn't really get a lot of media coverage. Okay? It's not something that we hear a lot about in the nightly news. If peacekeepers are doing their job well, then the result is peace and stability. And I might be being a little bit cynical here, but peace and stability doesn't really make for sensational media coverage, which feeds back into my first point. People don't really know what peacekeeping is about, and they don't really know what peacekeepers are doing. And the other point that I think you'll have to kind of tease through when you do your scripts and thinking about how to put your performance together. Where do peacekeepers fit within the Anzac legend? Okay, so we all know that the Anzac legend was forged during the First World War. It was reinforced during the Second World War. It's basically a distillation of the ideal characteristics of the Australian soldier. Civilian soldier, so volunteer, generally speaking. Very brave, inherently good at soldiering, doesn't let his mates down, all those kind of, you know the basic tenets of the Anzac legend. But really, peacekeeping, by its very nature, is not about rushing off to fight in a war. As I said, a lot of peacekeepers are very lightly armed, or they're not armed at all. They're not there to fight. They're there to either stop fighting or make sure that ceasefires or truces or whatever are being abided by. So they're not functioning in a combat role. Okay, it's actually the opposite. And the First World War, the Second World War, even Vietnam, was all framed in this idea of Australians going off to fight for their nation, for the safety, the security, the longevity, whatever you want to call it, of their nation. But again, by its very nature, peacekeeping is not about fighting for your nation. It's about sorting out other nations' conflicts or other nations' wars. So I think there are some tensions there when you try to fit peacekeepers within the Anzac legend. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe they don't fit within the Anzac legend. Maybe the Anzac legend itself is too narrow these days. It's very much about, as I said, the First and the Second World War, and that's not really an accurate reflection of what the modern Australian military or conflict experience is all about. And I know that some veterans of conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan have argued that the Anzac legend is actually quite difficult for them because they feel like they can't really connect to it, or that Australians expect them to be kind of something, and they feel like perhaps they're not. Okay, so some issues that you're going to have to work through. But hopefully, with the dedication of the Australian Peacekeeping Memorial in Canberra, with the release of the official history of Australian peacekeeping that came out just recently through the Australian War Memorial, with the efforts of school groups like you guys and the stories you're going to tell in your performance next year, this fascinating and long and complex history of Australian peacekeeping will start to be more fully known and more fully appreciated. So good luck with it. Look forward to seeing what you come up with in April next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much.